Morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Tuesday, March 1st meeting of the Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. Glad to have everyone here and glad to have everybody who might be listening online. Today's presentations are all about rate making. As I said, the good, the bad, and the ugly of rate making, and I'll let our presenters decide when and where they fit on the continuum. We're just glad they're all here to talk to us about it this morning. First up is Justin Grady, the Chief of Revenue Requirement from the Kansas Corporation Commission, to talk about rate competitiveness and rate making. And Mr. Grady, welcome back.
Got to raise that up quite a bit. Good morning, Chair Finch, members of the committee. My name is Justin Grady. I'm Chief of Revenue Requirements, Cost of Service, and Finance at the KCC, and I do appreciate the opportunity to appear before you this morning to discuss what I hope to be an informative and useful topic for you all. So we got a couple of topics or presentations that we've melded together. First, we'll just talk about rate making generally and what a rate case is and isn't, and what the objectives are, and what the legal framework is that governs that process. And then I'll give you guys an update on the Kansas electricity rate data and the competitiveness of Kansas's electric rates and how they compare to some of our surrounding states. So I'm on slide 3 now, and the agenda for the rate making process portion of the presentation. I won't, go into a lot of detail, but today we'll cover the regulatory compact generally, what that is, the specific legal standards that the Commission's required to uphold when it sets a rate. And we'll go into a fair amount of detail about the rate making process itself, but at times it'll get somewhat technical, but they're illustrative examples, really. They're real world examples, but they're examples to use to discuss the concepts. And if you have any questions about anything within the presentation, I can certainly answer those, whether it's within the presentation or at the end, and that's up to the chair. So we will talk about the types of cases that you see that, not every case or filing that changes rates is a rate case. That has a specific statutory meaning in Kansas law. And then we'll talk about there are different ways to set rates depending on the ownership structure of the utility. And then just, generally what a rate case looks like, and wind out or finish up with class cost of service and rate design. So I'm on slide 4 now. And this is the regulatory compact. Now, if you look up the regulatory compact, it's pretty specific to regulated cost of service type industries, and it generally is used in reference to the regulated utilities industry. You'll find, several different definitions or examples of it, but we like this one, and this is a quote out of Regulatory Research Associates. RRA they're now SNL, they're a division of S&P Global Financial, and they're a specialized research firm that focuses on investor-owned utilities, electric and gas. And they describe the regulatory compact as follows. Without reading that, if I were to describe it, the regulatory compact says, look, a utility has an obligation to serve, typically in a defined service territory, and they have an obligation to provide safe, reliable service. And Kansas, that is efficient and sufficient service, essentially. And the Commission has an obligation to provide that utility with an opportunity to recover its costs, with a strong likelihood that it will recover its costs and an opportunity to earn a reasonable rate of return. On the other hand, the customer has an obligation to pay lawfully approved rates, and the investor that's behind the scenes that you don't typically see if the utility is an investor-owned utility, and it's not a municipal or a cooperative, private investment capital, either through individual sales of stock to individuals or publicly traded, publicly raised capital in competitive capital markets. The investor is out there, provides that source of investment capital to the utility, and they have a right to have an opportunity to earn a reasonable return on that investment. And so So we'll talk about some of those concepts and flesh that out just a little bit more as we go through. So on slide 5, specifically the legal standards that apply and that govern the rate making process in Kansas are sort of North Star with regard to all rate setting, whether it's rate cases or property tax surcharge, whatever, is Kansas 66101B requires that utilities provide efficient and sufficient service at just and reasonable rates. And efficient and sufficient service is a pretty obviously broadly encompassing term, but it means safe, reliable service, however the commission defines what that should be. Just and reasonable rates, however, has been interpreted by the Kansas Supreme Court. What I've got there is a quote out of this 1986 case. Rates, and you start to see this balancing concept, the idea that the commission is it weighs substantial competent evidence. The commission makes its decisions based on evidence, and it balances the interests of everyone that's involved. So specifically, investors versus the ratepayers in the utility, present ratepayers versus future ratepayers, and then the public interest generally. Slide 6, continuing the legal standard discussion. This first quote is just another reference, a little more recent court case that reiterates the same standard as the Kansas Supreme Court case of 1986. KCC is required to balance the public need for adequate, efficient, reasonable service with the public utilities need for sufficient revenue to meet the cost of furnishing the service and to earn a reasonable profit. We mentioned that there's a constitutional basis behind this concept of just and reasonable. And so I have a quote there from Leonard Saul Goodman, the process of rate making, which is a widely respected, widely used rate making manual and reference to court cases. But the constitutional link to just and reasonable makes a lot of sense if you think about it. In this country, if you're a private individual or a corporation or an association, and you are using private investor capital to provide a public good or a public service, then you have a right to receive compensation for your investment and for your costs. That's the Just Compensation Clause of the United States Constitution. And so the 14th Amendment, you see it referenced as well in that's mostly due process. When you think about just compensation and the due process clause, then those are really important overarching elements of the rate making process. So I'm on slide 7 now. And so we've talked about rate making is largely a legal process, and that process is governed by Kansas statutes and our administrative rules and regulations, or maybe civil court proceedings. KCC rate making is in large part designed to produce substantial competent evidence that the commission can use to make a decision, weighing all of the different factors and all of the different parties and cases that make recommendations in order to determine a just and reasonable rate will then therefore allow the utility to provide efficient and sufficient service. It really is that's what it entails. And so this legal process occurs through the issuance of formal discovery, formal testimony, either written or oral. If we have an evidentiary hearing, then if you've ever watched one of those or participated in one, an evidentiary hearing, it's a formal trial with cross-examination of witnesses and opening statements and closing statements, and there's generally an evidentiary hearing for every major rate case, whether it settles or not. I mentioned there that a record consisting of at least 10,000 pages is not unheard of. That's not an exaggeration or just a number that we threw out there. We actually did the count for our rate study that we presented 3 or 4 years ago, and we just went back to a major Evergy or Westar rate case and totaled them up. As I talked about, due process is important, obviously, in any legal structure or system, and so due process is set out and formalized through a procedural schedule, which is on the next slide, slide 8. And this is a real procedural schedule from our most recent Black Hills rate case. This is the gas distribution rate case. Commission has 240 days to issue an order by law, as defined in 66-117. Staff and other interveners in the case, in this case, the only intervener was KERB, I believe, at least the only intervener that filed testimony. But staff and other interveners get around half of that 240 days to do our investigation. And that's where, and you'll see what some of those adjustments look like and what the different moving parts are of the equation. But that the meat of our investigation occurs within that 120 days. And in that period of time, we're issuing discovery and accumulating evidence and presenting, compiling direct testimony that's then filed before the commission. And that's our attempt at substantial competent evidence. This is what it takes this is a just and reasonable rate. Here are the costs that are necessary to provide efficient, sufficient service. So on slide 9, we talk about interveners. So KCC staff, who I'm a part of, our job is to represent the public generally. And I have on the slide that means we strive to balance the interest between the utility company, its shareholders, and its ratepayers. But I guess a little less formally, when I'm a fan of saying that we are analysts, not advocates, right? So we don't have a preconceived idea of a result of what the case should be or what it should look like, because our job is to balance the interests, and that's similar to the commission's job, and the Kansas Supreme Court has said you have to balance the interests. We try to take as broad and neutral and unbiased stance as we can in a rate case. We want to accumulate all the evidence. We like all of the different parties at the table, and hopefully the result of 21 minds is better than one results in a better rate making process that everybody can support. But we also have KERB, of course, they're statutorily authorized intervener. You're going to hear from Mr. Nickel later. They advocate on behalf of residential and small commercial ratepayers, and then other parties. So this is an actual list of all of the interveners that were in Evergy, Kansas Central's last rate case, the old Westar system, right? So there were 21 interveners in that case. You can see there are schools and large businesses, coalitions of other large businesses that join forces. Each one of these interveners, as you think about when we're getting ready to step through the rate making process and what that looks like, but each one of these interveners will have their own view of what rate base should be, an income statement, operating expenses, or rate of return, or what the class cost of service should look like, or rate calculations. And so each one of these, either individually or as part of a coalition, will file their position, their legal evidence into the record in direct testimony, and then they're part of the process. I mentioned there the last bullet point on that slide. Most rate cases do settle, and I would say most settlements are unanimous, but certainly not every rate case. I could probably recount from memory right now every rate case that I've personally litigated since 2002. They tend to create a lasting memory because they're a lot of work. But there is a note that every rate case since 2012, every Westar case since 2012 has settled unanimously. So this isn't a situation where, the evil government agency is forcing down these rates and everybody just has to accept it. It's much more formal and inclusive than that, and it includes the impact of all the parties that are ultimately going to be paying the rates. Okay, so on slide 10, this is just some of the ways that rates can change. And I mentioned earlier, not all cases that change rates are rate cases, right? But a rate case, a general rate case, if you ever hear that term, that refers to a full comprehensive evaluation of the utilities cost of service pursuant to 66-117. And a 66-117, if you look at that statute, it lays out what is required to be filed in a rate case. It talks about how you can get involved and participate, and when the commission has to issue an order. There's also abbreviated cases in Kansas that are authorized pursuant to the commission's regulations, and I have the reg there. Abbreviated cases are abbreviated in number of issues. They're not abbreviated by way of timeline, or they don't receive less review, but it's a situation where the parties, ahead of time, they realize, look, there are a few major issues that are going to change in this utility's cost of service. And of course, the only way to evaluate that or consider those is through a rate case. And so actually we have an abbreviated case pending before the commission right now. Empire District Electric Company, the Liberty Empire, has a case pending pertaining to its request to include in its rates and its rate base a wind farm investment that they made. And then there's a few other sort of minor issues that are included in that as well. But abbreviated rate cases are a tool that we use to adjust a utility's cost of service if there's some major factor that's going to occur, usually, right after we just did a full rate case. But and actually the reg requires that it's within 12 months of a full rate case. Fuel clause reviews, you see these referred to as energy cost adjustments or purchased gas adjustments. And, fuel clauses are extremely common in this country. The last I knew, or last I heard, I think there was one utility, maybe two, in the entire country that does not have a pass-through of its major commodity fuel costs. And these became highly prevalent in this country in the 1970s in response to some of the oil price shocks and increased volatility of energy prices. And what regulators determined was that when you have a cost that's this material, that's largely outside of the control of the utility, it doesn't make sense to require the utility to file a full general rate case to evaluate all of its costs when there's one major factor that's driving this utility's desire to change its rates. And so, there are different flavors and varieties of these, but again, literally, Portland General Electric Company is the only utility in the country that I'm aware of that does not have an ECA. And I think it's because they have so much hydropower that they just don't have a significant amount of fluctuation in their fuel expense. But you'll see those can get media attention. It's, typically the headline is, Evergy or Empire is raising their rates $100 million, but they're passing through their costs of energy production and or purchase power that comes from the integrated marketplace, and they're not alone in that. Every utility in the country does that. And then I've got a specific list of surcharges and riders, and these two get a lot of attention. Typically, there's a lot of customer confusion or angst about these. You'll read on social media posts or maybe in a news article that this is just them sneaking this through. It's nobody reviews these. It's just an extra source of profit. It's there's a lot of different misconceptions out there about surcharges and riders. But so every one of these riders and surcharges that I have listed here, you can see the statutory authorization for them. And every one of them is mandatory for the commission to approve it pursuant to the standards that are in the law, right? So this is just the state of affairs. The utilities have in Kansas right now, the state of the law is the top 4 surcharges and riders: property tax surcharge, transmission delivery charge, energy efficiency rider, and the gas safety reliability surcharge are statutory entitlements that the utility has. That's the state of the law. And so when they get filed, they are very prescriptively limited in terms of what costs the utility can recover through these surcharges and riders. And so, it's not true that they get less focus and attention. They probably get more focus and attention because I will assign 1 or 2 auditors to review these, and exclusively this. They're not reviewing it in the context of a rate case in which there's 10,000 other things to look at. So the commission issues an order in every instance with these surcharges and riders. And so anyway, the one exception to that rule that these are all statutorily authorized, legislatively granted riders is the System Integrity Plan rider. And so Atmos Energy, that's a gas distribution utility. In their last rate case, which was in 2019, the commission granted Atmos a supplement, the System Integrity Plan rider, and it's basically meant to be a supplement to the gas safety reliability surcharge. Atmos Energy has a lot of aging infrastructure in the ground, a lot of obsolete natural gas distribution infrastructure that needs to be replaced. And there's, of course, a public safety reason to do that. And after, it actually took 3 rate cases to get to the point where the commission approved this. And so I was involved in all 3 of those. And that, my view is that what we ended up with in the end was really a well-balanced, we litigated it because we couldn't agree with the company in terms of the frequency of rate change. But ultimately what resulted was a supplemental rider that's supplement to the gas safety reliability surcharge, because the GSRS has a cap of 80 cents per month per residential customer, and this allows about another 40 cents per month per residential customer to do that accelerated infrastructure replacement. And then on the bottom of slide 10, I mentioned Kansas Universal Service Fund audits. And so I think one of the questions, there was a representative a few weeks ago that had a question about ILEX or RLEX, rural local exchange carriers, and what we did with regard to rate making with them. And we don't set rates for ILEX or RLEX. We have the authority to do that, but they change their rates. They all set their rates at or below the state affordable minimum rate. And then that, I can't recall if that increases every year or every other year, but that's where they set their local rates. And then there is a subsidy program that we administer called the Kansas Universal Service Fund. Basically, the difference between what these utilities recover from this legally, statutorily authorized minimum affordable rate and their actual cost of service gets flowed through this Kansas Universal Service Fund. So we're not setting rates when we do a KUSF audit, but it's very much a similar process, and it uses all the same formulas and calculations that you'll see and that we talk about today. Yep, same overarching legal structure and framework as well, generally. So on slide 11, now we're going to get into, we'll start to talk about a little more of the technical side of what a revenue requirement calculation actually looks like. What are we actually doing and presenting in those 10,000 pages of evidence? The revenue requirement formula on the top is relatively straightforward. It's rate base times rate of return plus O&M plus A&G plus depreciation and taxes. And essentially that's just the entirety of the cost of service of a electric or gas or telecommunications company. That's what it takes for them to provide efficient, sufficient service. And so I mentioned here, it's primarily used for the large investor-owned utilities, Evergy, Empire, Black Hills, Atmos, and KGS. The rate base consists of, and we'll go into a few examples here in the next few slides, but rate base is all of the investor capital, essentially anything that's long-lived in nature that requires investment capital to support the enterprise and the operation of the providing electricity or gas distribution service. So this can be anything from a corporate headquarters building or a coal pile sitting on the ground outside of Jeffrey Energy Center. For an electric generating unit, wind turbines, or for an electric company, wind turbines or coal-fired generating units, Wolf Creek is in rate base. And that the accumulation of all of the investment capital that's necessary to provide service, then as we talked about, utilities have an opportunity to earn a rate of return that's firmly grounded in legal and regulatory theory. And so that rate of return that they have the opportunity to earn is the weighted average cost of capital. Okay, so the weighted average cost of capital is simply the cost of a particular type of capital times the proportion of that capital. And so the most simple example is just debt and equity. Utilities typically run around a 50-50 capital structure for a variety of reasons. And so if you have 50% of your cost of capital is debt, and I have an example here, and that debt is 5%, and it's 5% times 50% plus the cost of equity times the proportion of equity in the capital structure. And so that cost of equity, the return on equity is, one of the most contentious issues in a rate case. It can be a contentious issue. It's certainly an important issue to the utility. It comes up. It's one of the most contentious issues for a couple of reasons. It's contentious because it is pretty subjective. There are legal standards that guide and sort of provide the goalposts or the guidelines, but it's pretty subjective. And it's also the largest single monetary component that any one party has the ability to move the rates up or down. 10 basis points of equity from 9.4 to 9.3 can, I don't have the numbers, but it's substantial. It could be $5 million, so it's not unheard of for this item alone to be, $30 to $50 million worth of disagreement in a rate case. So it's a big issue. The cost of equity is it's theoretically determined. There are models that's objectively calculated and then sort of theoretically determined. With the cost of debt, you can back into via math and financial formulas. You can determine precisely what investors require to provide debt capital to the company, right? You can calculate it, and nobody disagrees with the calculation. But on the other hand, equity calculations are a little bit more esoteric. There's several financial models that people use to try to estimate it. And then there's the court cases that say the return needs to be commensurate with the risks that the utility is taking on. It needs to be similar to the opportunity that it would have to earn in other jurisdictions where they're providing return on equity. So it's a big fight. We are fortunate enough to have a long tenured employee, a managing financial analyst at the KCC that's recognized nationally as an expert. This man is he's a lifelong Kansan, and he's testified in over 100 cost of capital proceedings. So I'm proud to be associated with him, and he's a great value to us, because if he wasn't, if he didn't provide the service that he does to us, a cost of capital witness, which is a PhD from the University of Texas or from Penn State, they charge a significant sum for cost of capital testimony. It's not unheard of for them to charge $50,000 per case to come in and provide all this analysis and then testify. So that's the cost of equity. Right now, Evergy Kansas Central and Evergy Metro earn 9.3%, or they have an opportunity to earn 9.3% return on their investments. When that return was set, it was within the bottom 10 or 20 return on equities authorized anywhere in the country in history. So over 1,000, individually determined return on equity. So we generally are pretty aggressive in that area, and we generally lead the market. We can go back and talk about when we first broke the 10% mark in 2012, and literally when that order was read in the room, there were audible gasps from the back of the room because we gave KCPL 9.5%. And but what has happened in that time frame is that surrounding states and surrounding it's become more commonplace now to see numbers, and so they're trending down like that. So today 9.3% isn't all that extraordinary, but when we set it back originally in 2015 and then updated it in 2018, it was pretty aggressive. Quickly on the bottom there, you hear sometimes there's a misperception. You hear it in this building that a regulated utility company has a guaranteed return, or a monopoly, and it's a guaranteed return. But that's not quite accurate, right? They have an opportunity to earn, and they have a legal right to have an opportunity to earn a reasonable return. But things happen that, sometimes cost increases are faster than you thought, or you're out longer than you expected to be for a rate case, or whatever the case may be. These utilities can and usually do earn below their authorized return. On the other hand, there are opportunities for them to earn above that authorized return. Regulatory lag can go the other way if they have a especially hot summer for an electric utility and they don't have some sort of mechanism in place to share those over earnings, and they can earn above their authorized return. But what you'll hear a utility company say is that's the maximum we can earn. That's not the guarantee. Well, that's not quite the truth either, right? Because they can earn over that. If we get the evidence that they're over earning, it takes a couple of years to bring them in, accumulate all the legal analysis and evidence that you need to change that rate. And so it's an opportunity, and their actual return can fluctuate above or below the authorized return. So we'll pick up steam just a little bit here as we go through some of these numerical examples. There's nothing in particular that we need to focus on really any of these slides, but this is just a real world example of how you calculate a revenue requirement. So, the formula should look familiar to you. It's just rate base times rate of return equals the operating income that's necessary. Within that $15.9 million operating income that's necessary is all of the interest expense on debt and all of the required, the profit margin, the return on equity for investors. And then you compare that to how much they're currently earning in terms of operating income and the difference, and then you gross it up for federal taxes, not state, in the state of Kansas any longer, and you have your revenue requirement. So what you see when I talked about earlier, 21 different interveners, and we'll go through just a few more examples here of the detailed nature of this stuff, but all 21 of those interveners will have a position on what should the rate base be? What should the rate of return be? How about the operating income? Is the utility will they earn more in revenues, or will they have less expense over the next year or 2 years than they are alluding to? Should they be authorized to have a lower return on equity? Are they going to, refinance their debt costs? And so that needs to be less. Do they have too much debt or not enough debt in their capital structure? All of those kind of arguments. So slide 13 then is just that same rate base view. And this is, maybe I should have mentioned, these are actually screenshots out of our revenue requirement model, our spreadsheets that were filed with the commission. This is staff's finalized view in this most recent Black Hills rate case. But you can see there are different components and subcomponents of rate base. It might be deferred income tax assets or customer advances for construction. There are things that there's customer provided money that the company is holding pursuant to for legal reasons or, accepted regulatory theory. And we compensate the customer for that by offsetting the rate base against those amounts. So that's why you would see a negative amount there. And then accumulated provision for depreciation. The utility has the opportunity to earn a return, and it also is, has a legal requirement or opportunity to get just compensation. Well, the way the utility gets back their invested capital is through depreciation expense. So depreciation expense is basically you just take whatever the asset is, divide it over its expected lifetime, and they get 1/30 of their investment back over 30 years. Well, once they get that money back from the customer and they've gotten a return of their capital, they no longer need a return on their capital. And so that's why accumulated depreciation is an offset against rate base, right? So there's a certain amount of depreciation expense that accumulates every year that's built into rates. And so absent additional, investment in the utility system, rate base will decline over time because customers are paying back investors for the use of their capital. All right, slide 14. This is just a condensed version of what goes into an operating income calculation. I mean, this is actually out of our schedules, but our schedules don't provide the, 65 or 70 line items that would go into operating and maintenance expense, for instance, and the multiple sub. This is rolled up or summarized in form, but you can track these calculations back from these 3 slides. You can track them back to see that that's how Black Hills' revenue requirement was set in the last rate case. On slide 15, and this is an example. I pulled an electric utility, the last Evergy Kansas Central rate case and the 18328 docket, and these are the adjustments that staff made. So, I could talk about literally probably any one of these, but I mean, it gives you an example, starts to provide an example of sort of how comprehensive and complicated isn't quite the right word, but it's a detailed, comprehensive process. So we had, 6 or 7 witnesses directly assigned to different portions of the case. And what those witnesses would do would come in and say, your payroll expense was too high in the test year, and so it needs to be lowered and annualized like this, or you're not going to experience that expense in the future. And literally every intervener in a rate case will have adjustments very similar to this. The other thing, to mention is that I think I hit on this on a later slide, but there are very few of these adjustments that are so objective and quantifiably determined that they're not likely to be controversial, and or that everybody will just accept the one method of calculation. I mean, there are some, but it's just that a lot of what we're trying to do is predict the future. You're trying to take a test year and say, how is the next year or two going to be different than that? And there's a lot of ways to interpret that data. And the commission's job is to accumulate all that evidence and sort out winners and losers and then set the rate. So slide 16, we don't have to talk a lot about this, but it's basically, you hear that cooperatives are deregulated in Kansas, and they set their own rates. And for the most part, they do, but it's not accurate to say that, we don't set any cooperative rates, because we do. In Kansas, if those cooperatives or a municipal entity were to provide transmission service to somebody else other than an owner of its corporation, of the co-op, then there is a profit motive associated with that, because the more that person pays for service, the less I have to pay, and my neighbors and my bosses, right? The co-ops are owned by their customers. So Kansas law recognizes that a neutral third-party arbiter needs to exist to set that rate. And when we do so, it's a cost of service rate still. And so there are still some arguments about which costs are appropriate and necessary to provide service. But the margin on those rates is calculated a little differently. These are not-for-profit corporations, so we don't need to determine, the appropriate level of return on equity to induce the investor to continue to provide service to continue to provide capital so the utility can provide service. In this case, we're typically looking at a margin over their loan covenants. So debt service coverage or tier are different. When we talk about the definitions of those are financial margin measurements that exist in the loan covenants that are required by the lenders to actually lend these nonprofit businesses money. And so that's how we determine, a margin over interest or margin over debt service coverage. And the rest of the calculation is basically the same as the revenue requirement. So on 17, I've highlighted some of this as we went through, but this is just a little more, I guess. KCC's role, KCC staff's role in reviewing a rate case. I mentioned we're analysts, we're not advocates. We're looking for the right answer. We evaluate the utilities application for adherence to regulatory theory and previous commission orders and previous court cases. You can see those aren't just made up words. Those are real concepts, but eliminations, normalizations, annualizations. And when I was looking at this last night, I forgot one. There's also amortizations, right? Those all, what we're trying to do is get the best revenue requirement and rate that is the most reflective of what it actually costs to provide service, while at the same time recognizing that these are monopolies with captive customers that provide a absolutely vital service, and it's a lot of times you have no choice but to buy the service. And so, but it's that balancing act that the commission is charged with is what drives us and what we strive for as well. A lot of times we are considering, does the commission have all of the evidence and all of the information that it needs to make its decision and fulfill its statutory charge? And slide 18 is just, this slide doesn't nearly do this topic justice. So class cost of service and rate design. I could literally talk as long as we have to this point in this conversation about class cost of service and rate design, and I'm only going to talk about it for 20 seconds, right? It is basically where you take that revenue requirement after everybody argues about what the costs actually are to provide service and how much profit the utility should be allowed, and then you split that up into the different customer classes based on cost causation techniques. And there's a wide degree of differences of opinion with regard to that. Who should pay what amount? So out of those 21 interveners, maybe half of them will end up easily agreeing with our revenue requirement recommendation. But with regard to class cost of service, they have a completely different point of view and perspective. And so that's sort of it's another, giant ball of yarn that is, anyway. But basically you split up the revenue requirement into the different class costs and then actually develop rates. And you just do that with billing determinants. Some costs are fixed, some are variable, and that's rate design. Okay, I think we're doing good on time. I don't know, are you okay? All right, so on slide 19, now what we're going to do is move into this regional rate comparison issue. And so just by way of a little bit of background, I believe it was last session, Senate Bill 80 was introduced in the Senate Utilities Committee. We had a hearing on it, and it would have basically changed the law to require the KCC to provide this kind of information. And when we testified, we said, we will come down and talk to you guys about what rates are and how they're competitive with other states anytime. You don't have to change the law to do that. So we had a stakeholder group that was convened by Chairman Thompson, and we came to an agreement amongst everybody that was in the room that this is the information we would present for the next 3 years to the Senate Utilities Committee. And so, of course, we want to make it available to the House as well, and so that's what we're doing. This is the same exact information I presented to the Senate, but I've added 2 slides. And I added 2 slides because I presented those slides to the Senate Utilities Committee earlier this year in testimony on the bill. So So that's the actual language of on slide 19 of the agreement and what we're going to be looking at and presenting, and all that information's in here. So on slide 20, this is where we begin to get into the rate data. So as you notice in the agreement, it's EIA data, Energy Information Administration data. And the reason we use that is because it's widely available, it's free. They're a nonpartisan wing of the Department of Energy. Their only job is to collect information and distribute it and make it available to policymakers and information users. And so, but the downside to the EIA is that their information is a little dated. So you get the annual full year review by October of the following year. So the most recent data that we have is 2020. So if you look at the average electric rate for the state of Kansas, and this is the all-in average electric rate for the state of Kansas. One thing that's important to remember about this metric and this rate is that literally no one in the state pays this rate. Okay, this is not the rate for electricity. The way this is calculated, and because it's EIA data, you can go in and look. It's just all revenue from all electric utility sales in the state. So investor-owned utilities, munis, co-ops, and everybody else, divided by all usage, all kilowatt hour usage of all of those customers. So it's this grand blending or weighted average. If you have more industrial sales in your state, which you'll see, industrial electricity is far cheaper than residential electricity, then that really drives down that weighted average. If you have more residential customers, it drives it up. And the other thing to remember is it's highly sensitive to volumetric data, right? Because it's strictly revenue divided by sales. So if one utility or one state has more fixed charges than another, or has rate cases less frequently, or what, you just think about all the different things that could affect revenue, but the denominator goes up or down because of weather or warmer summer or colder winter, then it's going to make it look like a rate change occurred, right? And it did, according to this calculation, but it's not the rate that anyone pays for electricity. It's not the rate that's sitting on the tariff books at the KCC. It has its limitations, but it also has, I guess it has some benefits in that it's readily available. Anybody can go pull it up, and it's part of the conversation. We agreed to put it in the report. But you can see that year over year, average electricity rates in the state of Kansas, this calculation increased by 1.17%. You can see where that metric compares to surrounding states and the United States average. And you can see what the 2016 over 2020 change is. It's just strictly calculated as 2020 divided by 2016, All right, so on slide 21, there's one other thing I want to mention. So it sounded like I was a little bit critical of this all-in rate view, and it's just because I can't help it. I'm a numerical auditor by trade, and I unfortunately, it's the most commonly referenced metric, and in my view, it is literally the least informative metric about how we compare to other states with regard to electric rates. So we always recommend, if you're going to do it, let's have an honest conversation, do industrial to industrial, residential to residential, commercial to commercial, and then we think that average bills has a place in the discussion as well. And you'll see you presented that data. So on slide 21, industrial rates for Kansas, on average across all utility ownership types, declined by 0.71% in 2020. And you can see where we stand and what our competitive stance is compared to the states surrounding us and the United States in total. And then on 22, this is where we're talking about residential rates. So again, across all utility ownership types, in 2020, Kansas's average electric rate for residential customers increased by 1.08%. And you can see where we stack up and compare to the other states in the region. But remember that 1.08%, because on the next slide, on slide 23, you start to see how the way that all-in rate is calculated can really affect the end result, right? So, though it's not on this slide, but average residential electric usage declined by 0.9% in 2020. And so when you have a 1.08% increase in the rate, but the usage declined by 0.9%, the average monthly electric bill increased by 0.23%. And so, I don't know, there's all kinds of interesting observations. If you look through this table, you can see states with lower residential rates, but a lot higher usage, and they pay a lot more. You can see states with a lot higher rates than Kansas, but lower usage, and they pay a lot less. So, and then what I think is sort of fascinating to me is if you just look at North Dakota and Kansas. Those two are just really interesting. I think earlier in a hearing in Senate Utilities, somebody mentioned North Dakota. North Dakota's rates are so much less than Kansas's, but just so it's true, this all-in residential rate's 23% higher than North Dakota, and they have 23% less, or I'm sorry, Kansas's rate is 23% higher than North Dakota, and they use 23% more electricity on average. And so there's virtually no difference in what customers actually pay for electricity. And I haven't done a detailed analysis into what the return on equity is for North Dakota utilities or their cost structure. I'm sure we could go back to our rate study and look at that and really dig into their utilities. But literally, if there was no other difference other than they use 23% more electricity than us because of the way the math works, the denominator will make that rate lower, right? So anyway, that's the data. You can see where the average monthly bill, where we stack up to our neighbors and compared to the United States. Okay, slide 24. Now, this is the first time we've gotten into talking about individual companies' specific electricity rates, right? Everything prior to this has been a discussion about statewide, across all utility ownership types, et cetera. But these are the two slides that I added because I provided these in testimony earlier to the Senate. And this is again EIA data, but it's the investor-owned utilities in the state. Okay, and so it's Empire, Evergy Kansas Central, which is the old Westar system, Evergy Metro, which is the old KCPL system, and Evergy South, which is the old KG&E system. And they have the same tariff rates on the books at the KCC, but they're still separate operating companies, and they provide data to EIA and FERC and others separately. And so you can get different rate calculations just based on how this is calculated, right? It's revenue minus sales. So anyway, I've got them all three there. You can see how rates have changed in the last 6 years in Kansas. And I've calculated the compound average growth rate of how residential rates in the last 6 years have changed. And, on average, it's been around less than half the rate of inflation. On slide 25, it's just the same data, but graphical. That's just a graphical representation of it. Slide 26 is kind of that similar view, but again, this is for Evergy. They tend to get the most focus and attention in these discussions. We have this data. We've been tracking it for years, and so again, we think bill data needs to be part of the conversation. So that's why we advocated that it be included in the information that we present to the committees. And so this is the EIA calculated Evergy bill data. And so you see the second to the bottom line there. You can see over the last 10 years how those bills have changed, what the compound annual growth rate has been of that increase, and this is what customers are actually paying. And then this is the impact that customers are actually seeing and what they're feeling. And then on slide 27, that's just the same data, but it's graphed. It's a graphical representation of the line graph. And slide 28. So Attached to the presentation information, I pulled the raw data from EIA. So you can look at that. There's calculations in terms of how each of the utilities in Kansas compare to the median or to the average, how the average bill compares to the median or the average. Average at Kansas Central, the Westar system, ranks 11th highest in rates out of 38 utilities. They're 16th highest out of 38 utilities in bills. Their rates are 10.24% higher. Their bills are 7% higher. You can see there's the average of Kansas Metro information as well, and the commercial, their commercial rates and their industrial rates. And, you know, all of that information is supported and calculated, attached to the presentation. And then lastly, and quickly, on slides 29 and 30, we also agreed there were various interests in this stakeholder group that were interested in presenting the commercial and municipal rates as well, and how they compare to states surrounding Kansas. And a bit of a cautionary note, I guess, about this data is that what I found out was not every Kansas cooperative or municipal utility submits their data to EIA to be included in this report. And I presume that that's because they're not regulated by the federal government and they don't have to. They don't want to go to the time and effort that it takes to report this data. But you know, I figured that out by looking at the raw data that goes into these numbers. And I guess the only thing I have to presume is that it's similar in the other states as well. And so if you assume that the same data limitation exists, then hopefully the information is useful. But and you can see residential, commercial, and industrial all-in rates and where they compare to their neighbors. And then on the municipal side as well, it's the same information: residential, commercial, and industrial. And you know what's really interesting to me is the vast majority of these rates are set by city councils or, you know, a board of directors that's elected from the owners of the company. And the rates itself is a little different, but the fundamental relationship between residential, commercial, and industrial tends to be very similar. And that just goes to show you that, you know, it's not totally a random process, I guess. And that's it. That was the end of my prepared remarks. So certainly look forward to questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. Questions? Everybody awake? Welcome back to session. Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Justin. Couple is, early on you talked about interveners. How are those determined by the commission, who gets to intervene and who does not?
So I can't recall if there's a statute or regulation that you know, describes provides the guardrails and the rules for intervention. But it's basically if you have a bona fide interest in the case, if you have you represent clients that pay the rates, or if you can show that you have a specific vested interest in the outcome of the case, and the commission will allow the intervention. I mean, there are times where, especially in big complicated cases like a merger, there might be 40 people that intervene. And so there are times where the commission has grouped together interest or customers with similar interests just for administrative expediency. But I mean, essentially you get, intervention. The commission's pretty loose with regard to allowing intervention.
One other question, you used the term regulatory lag in your presentation. Could you just kind of briefly describe that?
Sure. So
thank you.
Regulatory lag is just my definition is it's the time period that passes between when a utility's cost changes and when that cost is recognized in utility rates, right? So, I mean, regulatory lag can be either positive or negative for a utility. If a utility is in a declining capital cost environment, regulatory lag is helpful, right? Because we set rates, when we set rates, they're prospective in nature. That's the other thing I should have probably focused on a little bit more. They're perspective in nature. Everybody does the best job they can to sort of predict the future. And then they're set until they file another rate case, or we do have the ability to show cause them and pull them in if we need to and say, hey, your rates are too high. But that time separation that's regulatory lag.
Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Say, you had mentioned that you don't, here later in your presentation, you were talking about you haven't looked at other rates of return. When we look at the comparative rates and how things stack up, does anybody look and just kind of step back and say, man, this is an incredibly complex and consuming process and expensive to both the state in terms of the KCC and the utility, and it spits out rates that are among some of the highest. So I just wondered, does someone look and just say, what's going on in other states? For example, Oklahoma looks comparatively pretty good on a lot of these slides. Is it the utility? Is it their portfolio? Is it their administration? Or is it the rate-making process? Does somebody take a look at that and say, how can we improve our process here? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. So in a rate case itself, unless somebody brings up as part of the evidence, this state does it this way and they do or do not have this particular mechanism, or, it frequently comes up on return on equity evaluations, of course, typically because we are recommending a return on equity that the utility believes is horrendous, right? It's way too low. It's confiscatory. It's the lowest in the country. What are you guys doing? And so yeah, the information, as long as it's relevant to the issue at hand, and it means substantial competent evidence, and at the end of the day, that results in a result that's balanced between all those legal standards, then it's entertained and it's part of the process. The other thing I would suggest is this is not a new topic, obviously, right before this committee or others. For around the last 5 or 6 years, this has been since around the time that Evergy's rates got close to the national average, this has been a very hot topic. And so we decided to do a rate study after the 2018 merger. And so myself and my boss spent, and a few people that report to me, literally hundreds, if not, 1,000 or more hours doing a truly deep dive analysis to try to find out precisely the answer to your question. We looked at every investor-owned utility, 23 of them, in the surrounding states that are in this rate comparison. And we said, what's the deal? What drives the difference in our cost structure to theirs? And what you find is, I encourage you to take a look at that document. The link is in the presentation. It's 225 pages long. You don't have to read all of it, but I assure you, you'll learn everything you ever wanted to know about, at least as of 2018, how do we do this compared to others? A lot of it, and then the other thing is, right, the legislature hired a consultant to do a rate study, phase 1 and phase 2, and there's no easy answers. That's what the consultants said as well. If you ask me why our rates are what they are today, look at that rate study. But Oklahoma and Texas have been exceptionally fortunate with very low and stable natural gas prices for a long time. And we have a much more coal-heavy and wind-heavy fleet in Kansas. And so that alone is a big part of it. But there's so many other factors. And, I guess last quick answer to your question, commissions themselves are rated, we're ranked by that entity, RRA. And I don't, I think they rank us in part to try to put pressure on us to get more investor friendly, but especially during hearings like this, I kind of view it as a badge of honor. The Regulatory Research Associates ranks the KCC in the bottom 12.5% of investor friendly. If it's not 12.5, it's 25%. I can get the ranking, but we are below average negative in terms of public utility commissions that are friendly to investors, right? So The other thing I sometimes say in these is that, you know, if we're doing our job, nobody likes us. Nobody's happy, right? CURB disagrees with us. The company disagrees with us. And so I don't know that we're doing a perfect job, Representative, but I'm sure we're not. But hopefully that does your question some justice.
Representative Keither. Okay.
If we could be provided maybe by staff, what the turnaround time is when you, in terms of days, you know, when you say you have a case, you have so many days to make your answer available. And I think to have that in one spot, I'm sure it's on your website, but if we could just have that for the committee people, that would be wonderful. And I also wanted to thank the presenter this morning. You did a fabulous job and covered a whole lot of territory. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and we certainly can do that, provide that.
Other questions for this conferee? Justin, I certainly want to thank you. That's a lot of material to cover in a short amount of time, and you did a great job. I'm sure if we have other questions from the committee, we'll get those funneled to you. And if something else comes up here in the next half hour, we may call you back up. But
I look forward to that and appreciate the opportunity today. My email is on the front cover of this, so we'll get you guys an answer.
all right, if you want to send fan mail to Justin, it's right there. So next up, we have Mr. David Nickel from CURB. He's a consumer counsel. He's been with us before to testify on resolution. Here today to give us a little bit of background on CURB.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, obviously, Mr. Grady is the good in the triumvirate. I probably occupy the bad, and may I KCC itself, because the KCC commissioners believed that it was important to have an advocate for residential and small commercial ratepayers in rate cases. In 1991, the Kansas Legislature made us an independent agency, so we're no longer a division of the KCC, we're our own independent agency. We are a member of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, and why that's important is that the norm in the United States is that there are a number of different consumer advocates for residential, small commercial, and other small ratepayers in the rate-making process. So we're just one of a many of a network. We're completely fee-funded. We do not receive any state tax revenues. Our budget is approximately $1 million a year. It's hovered around there for quite some time. That's the equivalent of basically $1 per year per customer or less. There's not much cost to our representing those customers in total. We have 7 staff members. There's myself, we have 2 attorneys, we have 2 rate analysts, and then 2 administrative staff. The NASUCA medium staff size is 8.5 FTEs. We're less than that. The median budget for consumer advocate offices in the United States is $2.4 million. We're clearly below that. Turning to slide 3. CURB's mission derives from its statutory authorization as set forth by the legislation that created CURB. Our mission is to represent residential and small commercial ratepayers zealously in 3 different fora. First is before the KCC. We practice in all rate cases, in such cases as involve electric vehicles, energy efficiency, reliability matters, etc. In the past 3 years, we've collaborated with various parties. In the past 3 years, we've been involved in 100% of all the rate cases that have been filed. We're actively involved in all of those cases. We file testimony, we do our own analysis, we do our own discovery, we do our own briefing, we present our own analysis. We are an advocate, as opposed to, as Mr. Grady indicated, they're an analyst. We are an advocate. We advocate clear-throatedly on behalf of residential small commercial ratepayers. We've also been involved in 98.5% in the last 3 years of all other cases, excluding certificate of convenience cases, complaint cases that have to do with very small one-person complaint cases which don't really affect a residential class generally. And so 98.5% of those cases we intervene in. So we're very active before the KCC. In the past year, fiscal year 21, we were involved in over 100 cases before the KCC. So it's a mainstay of our organization. We also testify and analyze bills before the Kansas Legislature. I've had the pleasure of speaking before this committee before. We testified on behalf of the Securitization Act, which the legislature passed last year. I'll get to that in a while. And as you know, this year we testified in support of HCR 5023. We also have authority, alone on the authority among state agencies on KCC matters to appeal to the appellate courts with regard to decisions made by the KCC. That's a very small time element of our case because most cases are not appealed up. Turning to the next slide, you'll see that how we spend our time. So 54% of our time in fiscal year 21 was spent on KCC cases. 25% of our staff time was spent on policy research. And why that's important is policy research leads directly to our work before the Kansas Corporation Commission. For example, I furnished to this committee a small introductory part of a draft paper that we're working on energy efficiency. It is not a surprise that we have an energy efficiency docket that's pending before the commission. We tend in this paper to look at best practices of various states with regard to these issues, and we intend to use that paper and the concepts that are employed therein to do a good job of advocating for our constituents in that case. KCC cases have become much more complicated and time-consuming. In the first half of fiscal year 22, we spent 74% of our time on KCC cases. Our role in KCC cases is our core value. The importance of CURB in this procedure stems from what Mr. Grady said, is the substantial and competent evidence standard that's mandated by statute and by constitutional principle before the KCC. So we have KIC and KLER that's represented by their groups. We have large commercials like Walmart that are represented. We have the KCC staff, which is an analyst that represents the public generally or thinks about matters from the public generally, tries to balance interests of the various parties. But the residential and small commercial class are so small that they could never on themselves intervene in a KCC rate case or any KCC case for that matter. They're complicated, they're very time consuming, they're also very expensive. The typical rate case, you have accountants, you have economists, you have all different sorts of experts that are involved, all at very expensive rates. So CURB represents residential and small commercial ratepayers. Without CURB, residential and small commercial ratepayers would not have clear voted advocacy before the KCC. Moreover, good public policy dictates that there be a wide, broad area of evidence from which the commission could make its decision. The importance of, or how we represent our constituents can be seen on the next slide. I show the 5 different members of the CURB, of the board. They hail from different congressional districts. They're appointed by the governor for 4-year staggered terms. We, by statute, follow the direction of the board in all of our cases. We have a number of board meetings that we talk about our cases on a periodic basis, and then on big cases, we actually do an individual consultation with the various board members. There is nothing political about the appointment of the board. Each member of the board in my tenure has always been dedicated steadfastly to the proposition that we need to have reasonable rates in Kansas. These board members are all volunteer. They are not paid for their time. They work 50 to 100 hours a year for free, representing their constituents before the Kansas Corporation Commission through CURB. Have we been successful? And our performance-based budgeting shows that with collaboration of the various parties, that we have saved over the past 3 fiscal years an average of $90 million per year in rate case cost. We generally work with other parties such as the KCC staff, KIC, Natural Gas Transportation Coalition, Customer Coalition, and others to try to achieve the rate savings that we come up with. Right now, we're working with the KCC on a rate case that is pending before the commission, and we hope we continue to add value with that. I'd like to turn to one particular case, if you could, that's been determined by the commission, and that's the Winter Storm Uri case for Kansas Gas Electric. In that case, KGS sought to bring in about $461.5 million with regard to extraordinary cost. They were going to carry that cost at their weighted average cost of capital, which Mr. Grady described as a mixture of their equity cost and their debt cost. That's just about 8%. We worked with NGTCC on that matter to try to reduce that down to about 2%. We also ask that KGS take into consideration the low-income customers that they have on their system and try to work a low-income tariff, because even though the costs have been, it will be through securitization, will be somewhat low, any cost to somebody that is energy burdened is difficult. So we managed to get, with the help of NGTC and others, we managed to get those costs down, those carrying cost to about 2%, and that results in a multi-million-dollar savings to consumers. We do have KGS planning to offer some type of low-income tariff, and then we will use securitization thanks to the work of this legislature in terms of getting that done. We hope to add value to our KCC cases. One of the things that we think is important in the upcoming term is to adopt cost-effective energy efficiency. Kansas rates 46th in state ranking in terms of energy efficiency. There's a case pending before the commission. We hope that some cost-effective programs will evolve from that filing. We also think it's important to address energy burden in Kansas. According to national studies, about 23% of households in the United States have incomes at or below the federal income level, but still pay at least 3 or more times their cost of their 3% of their 3 times the percent of their annual income on energy costs relative to others. Those statistics really don't really impact you, but let me give you an example. My wife teaches kids inside their home. So she's in the home one day of a family when the electricity went off. They've been cut off because they couldn't afford their bills. And my wife describes the look on the mother's face, the look of bewilderment, the look of embarrassment, the look of fear, the look of, I need help, but I don't know where to reach. If we can't help those people in Kansas that face the decision of whether or not to use energy or buy food, to use energy or pay for their medicine, then we've lost sight of what's really important in Kansas. We hope to help that through reducing rates, through low income tariffs, through energy efficiency and other means. And then we need to improve our outreach. We're here as consumer advocates. We need to make sure that we're reaching out to our public, and we'd love to be more of assistance to Kansas legislators. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Committee questions? Any hands up on WebEx? Any questions here in the room? Representative Delperdang.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You had mentioned that the CURB is a small Kansas government agency. So where does the funding actually come from?
The funding comes from utility bills that are, it's an add-on in terms of the utility bills that go out to utility customers throughout the state.
Okay. And is it directly funneled to CURB? Does it go into the Kansas for the SGF and then over to you, or?
No, it does not go. It's directly funded to us through various assessments. We assess our cost, and then those costs that go to us. So it's a direct funding from the utilities, from utility bills to CURB.
Other questions for this conferee? Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the earlier testimony, they mentioned that the last several cases have been unanimously agreed to. So I would assume that you feel that You had gotten an outcome such that you were one of the unanimous agreements to those cases. Is that fair?
That's a very fair statement. I do, if I could, Representative, turn to your question. You ask about looking for best practices. We do. As part of our National Association of State Consumer Advocates, we look at best practices on various rate cases and various other cases. We are involved in a group of consumer advocates from Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, that we meet bi-monthly to talk about cases that are coming up before our various agencies, before their various PSCs, and talk about best practices. So we do look into that. And to answer your question directly, yeah, we applying those standards, we found that the settlement cases that we've gone into do benefit the residential and small commercial ratepayer. We wouldn't have signed off on them.
Any other questions for this conferee? Mr. Nickel, thank you. Thank you for the work that CURB does on behalf of residential ratepayers here in the state.
Thank you.
Committee, we have about 9 minutes left. I'm not going to ask Mr. Snyder to try to shoehorn his presentation into our remaining time, and I tell you that we start on time and we end on time, and I keep that commitment to you. We have asked Mr. Snyder and Mr. Zakura to come back on Thursday. They'll start off the line. Right away. But any and all things property law that you might have concerning utilities, be ready for those on next Tuesday. I anticipate that we will get a couple of bills referred to us. And so if that's the case, you can plan on next Thursday probably being a hearing day for those. And by next, I mean a week from 2 days from now. We would probably hear bills, and then we'd have the last week to work bills. And for any additional presentations that we have, we are working on one more about Southwest Power Pool for you before we wrap up our committee work for the session. So that's kind of where we're at. So you have a roadmap for where we go from here. Are there any questions or anything for the good of the order? Okay, seeing none, with that, we will adjourn, and we'll lead off with Mr. Snyder on Thursday. Thank you all.